Exactly what occurred in the 5th episode of the 5th season of The Chosen. Last Supper, Part 2. A cold opening for the Last Supper. Immediately with the insight that one of the disciples is going to betray Jesus. Matthew 14 verse 18, John 13 verse 21. The opening sequence of the Last Supper begins. After Jesus has finished preparing a cup of wine, a few of his followers approach him and inquire, "Is it I, Lord?" On the other hand, some people argue amongst themselves over who it might be. Mark 14 verse 19. At the same time that Judas is pointing out how angry Thomas has been about Rama and wondering if it may be him, Simon Z is perceptive enough to recognize that Judas has also been unhappy about the situation. In spite of his fury, Jesus reassures Thomas that he has been faithful throughout his life. Even Thomas seemed to be questioning himself, because he was the one who brought Jesus to Peter. Andrew is adamant that Peter could not be the one who betrayed him, and he is also adamant that he could not be the one who betrayed him. However, Andrew is critical of John for his desire to sit at Jesus' right hand once more. In the end, Jesus is able to calm the disciples down and remind them of his teachings of grandeur and servant leadership. Luke 22 verses 24 to 27. Jesus is asked by Peter what he anticipates they will do with the news that has been revealed. In Luke 21 verses 28 to 30, Jesus gives them the assurance that they will in the future have a greater understanding of the situation and that they will one day sit at his table and judge the 12 tribes of Israel. The question of whether or not the betrayer will be allowed to judge a tribe is raised by this. But Jesus assures them that they will be able to resolve this issue. In order to enter the Dainu from episode 4, they take the cups of wine, dip their fingers into the wine, and then release 10 droplets. These drops correlate to the 10 plagues that occurred during the Exodus. In the 5th episode of the 5th season of The Chosen, the religious leaders. At the beginning of the main episode, Yanni and other religious leaders are shown walking with Ananus, who is the son of Annas and the brother-in-law of Caiaphas. They are having a conversation with Jesus about the situation. Barnaby is able to overhear their chat and makes a light-hearted joke about Ananus, pointing out that his father decided to give his brother-in-law the family inheritance as well due to the fact that he had a limp. Ananus is of the opinion that everyone is getting worked up over nothing. He believes that if Jesus is unable to bring about genuine change, the people will be jolted out of their concentration on the situation by the inconvenient realities of living under Roman taxation. He has the impression that Caiaphas does not have a good understanding of human nature, and he has the hope that his father will be sorry that he chose to pass the priesthood on to him when he makes a mistake in managing the issue. At the time that Ananus arrives at Caiaphas' residence, the tension that exists between the two is barely concealed, and Caiaphas' wife, who is Ananus' sister, is required to encourage her brother to cooperate. Ananus, however, is informed by Caiaphas that his visit is not required because he has already made the decision to arrest Jesus instead. When the religious authorities raise the objection that there is not enough time to locate Jesus and hold a legitimate and lawful trial before the festival and Shabbat, Caiaphas ignores their concerns and assures them that his agents are now searching for a place where Jesus can be found. Later on, the Sanhedrin continues to discuss the appropriate course of action for Jesus. During the time that the house of Shammai is exerting pressure for a more severe response, Shimon starts to show signs of uncertainty. He is able to empathize with the need to adjust practices to the ever-changing environment. "Zeal for your house has consumed me," Psalm 69 verse 9, is the line that Shmuel quotes, which is ironic because Simon Z uses the same verse for Jesus. Yosef, however, reminds out that David's own deeds would surely raise the ire of the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas ultimately intervenes and argues that the only way for them to have any chance of success is to secretly arrest Jesus. In spite of the fact that he is praying for God to assist them, he is simultaneously accusing Jesus of being a necromancer and a sorcerer. He is drawing attention to the fact that God's eternal word has been slandered and that his holy temple has been extensively damaged. When Caiaphas has finished praying and has dismissed the assembly, Shmuel is torn because he has come to the realization that he is aware of what he should do in order to arrest Jesus in a peaceful manner. That evening, Shmuel makes his way to Caiaphas' house and reveals that Caiaphas had a realization after praying that he knew a possible asset who might lead them to Jesus. These revelations are made public. As a result of his satisfaction, Caiaphas requests that he bring the asset in and agrees to take care of any issues that may arise. Subsequent to receiving orders, Shmuel brings Judas to the residence of Caiaphas. Season 5, Episode 5 of The Chosen, which focuses on the disciples. As Jesus and his followers make their way back from Bethany, they come across the fig tree that Jesus had cursed at the beginning of their journey. Peter is taken aback to see that the tree had died overnight. Mark 11 verses 20 to 21. According to Mark 11 verses 22 to 24, Jesus reprimands Peter for being astonished by this and adds that he performed this miracle to demonstrate to them that prayer has the power to move mountains and do things that are apparently impossible. In addition, the tree is a representation of the temple, which he visited in the hope of acquiring fruit, only to find that it was devoid of any beneficial elements. Once again, Jesus predicts that he would be delivered up on Passover, crucified, and die, which surprises the disciples because executions are often not permitted on holy days. Jesus warns them all to expect hardship, hostility, and death in the coming period. He also predicts that he will die. As they return to Jerusalem, the disciples continue to grapple with the words that Jesus spoke and comfort one another, with Judas standing separate from the other disciples throughout this process. Peter is adamant that Jesus is simply going through a difficult moment and that he does not intend to say the words that he has just said. John asserts that they are blind and deaf. See John 12 verses 38 to 40, for not knowing what is going on, despite the fact that Andrew indicates that it might be a test and Simon Z wonders whether it might just be a warning to get ready. Thomas strongly disagrees with Matthew's suggestion that they take Jesus at his word, arguing that doing so would require them to acknowledge that they had been misled and that Jesus is not the Messiah. Judas contends that Matthew and Thomas may both be correct in certain respects. It is possible that Jesus will, in fact, be delivered up, but that he will use his divine abilities at the very last moment to avoid death, defeat his adversaries, and usher in the age of the Messiah. Suddenly, the disciples engage in a furious discussion. Simon Z goes outside, insisting that he has not squandered the previous 3 years on a phony Messiah. While he is wandering around, he comes dangerously close to coming into Atticus and a group of Roman soldiers who are patrolling the streets. Because he is following Atticus, he witnesses him capturing Caphne. While all is going on, Mary Magdalene is walking through the streets of Jerusalem when she is abruptly confronted by a group of men who are commanded by the mysterious Watcher. He assures her that they have no intention of causing her harm and that they aim to assist her. They will need to put her in a hood and transport her to a specific location in order to accomplish this. As soon as she accepts, she hops inside their cart. At first glance, it appears as though they are going to take her to the residence of Caiaphas. However, it turns out that this seems to be a trick of editing. It has come to their attention that they have, in fact, arrived at the residence of Nicodemus, Pilate, and Atticus in the 5th episode of the 5th season of The Chosen. While Claudia, who is clearly fatigued out of sorts, is sitting on her bed, she is listening to the soothing sounds that her personal musicians are playing over and over again. Pilate, who is located in the adjacent room, is attempting to work, but she becomes irritated and suddenly bursts into her room, asking her what is wrong with her. Claudia is unable to express in detail what she is experiencing in her dreams. However, she is certain that someone or something terrible is going to take place in the city, and she strongly recommends that Pilate send her to Caesarea. Although Pilate is adamant that he cannot leave the city during such a crucial period, he is also adamant that he does not want to send her out on her own because doing so would create a negative impression of him. In light of the fact that he has a history of violent behavior, Claudia comes to the realization that she does not want to abandon him in Jerusalem. This is a comment that irritates Pilate, who maintains that she has never been forced to make difficult decisions in the past. As Pilate exits the room, he discovers Atticus waiting for him somewhere else. Atticus discloses that the Pharisees intend to capture Jesus to carry out their plot. Pilate makes an effort to disregard this issue, with the expectation that he will be able to simply find the Pharisees, therefore putting them back in their proper place and recouping some of the cash that he had lost. To Pilate's chagrin, however, Atticus confronts him and reprimands him for not taking the situation and his responsibility seriously. He explains to Pilate that he has a strategy to deal with the situation, but that there will come a point when Pilate would be required to take charge and fulfill his responsibilities with the situation. After some time has passed, Atticus leads a group of Roman soldiers on a raid to the residence, where Caphne and his rabble-rousers are currently present. In spite of the fact that Caphne gives up, one of the men fights back and is killed by Atticus after being violently beaten down. A review of the 5th episode of the 5th season of The Chosen. Aside from the major revelation that occurs at the conclusion of the episode, Episode 5 is a more subdued episode that appears to be preparing the audience for the concluding act of The Chosen Season 5. Despite this, it has a number of positive aspects. Last Supper cold open. I've been speculating that Judas would divert attention away from himself by referring to Thomas's resentment towards Rama. While it is true that the show does a good job at doing this, I do admire the fact that some of the disciples are able to see through the deflection as well. I find the moment that Thomas has with Jesus to be extremely powerful. I like how he appears to be sincerely questioning himself, and how Jesus reassures him that he has been faithful despite his wrath. Another aspect of this moment that I found enjoyable was the way it rekindled the tension that existed between the sons of Zebedee and the sons of Jonah. Richard Fancy continues to provide a riveting performance as Caiaphas, which is consistently praised by the audience. It is really interesting to observe his conceit and his ability to deceive others. In the role of Atticus, Elijah Alexander portrays a commanding presence. Excellent is the manner in which Sean Sharma, in his role as Shmuel, glides between a furious certainty and an interior battle. The author, Luc Demien, does an excellent job of expressing Judas' sense of isolation and his fervent desire to assist others in understanding his perspective. In addition, as I indicated before, Joey Vahidi does an excellent job in the sequences that make up his opening. Finding solutions to biblical problems. When Christians read the Gospels, they frequently have a difficult time providing an explanation for the actions of the disciples. It has been told to us that Jesus foretold his suffering and death on several occasions. Nonetheless, the disciples continue to appear surprised when everything actually takes place. The 5th episode does an excellent job of demonstrating a variety of various ways in which the disciples could have rationalized away the predictions that Jesus made. In addition to this, the show provides Judas with a reasoning and explanation that is plausible for his own acts. It is true that we are aware that Judas was given money. On the other hand, we are aware that he readily gives up his money. Furthermore, if you have witnessed someone walking on water, it is highly unlikely that you will betray that person for the sole purpose of obtaining financial gain. The show has gradually developed the concept that Judas, 1, is convinced that he was chosen to contribute his own wisdom. 2, believe that he sees things even better than Jesus. 3, believes that the other disciples do not understand him. And 4, believes that he should take matters into his own hands, even if it means crossing ethical boundaries. In this situation, his ultimate choice appears to be realistic and logical, despite the fact that it is still evil. Irony. The 5th episode has a number of delicious ironies, such as Judas' insistence on making a contribution to Jesus' work, Caiaphas' prayer against the blasphemy of the eternal word, Shmuel's assertion that Judas is an answer to prayer, and so on. Coherence. In previous seasons, I used to bemoan the fact that there was a lack of coherence over the entire season. There were times when stories that would have been more effective if they had been told over the course of an entire season, for example. The events that led to Mary's trauma, her fall, and her restoration were crammed into only 1 or 2 episodes. Despite the fact that I have not previously brought this to your attention, I would want to extend my compliments to Season 5 for being the most cohesive and streamlined season to date. In addition to allowing events to occur in parallel with one another, This has provided the narratives with the breathing room that they require, which is something that I enjoy. Despite my desire to avoid spoilers, I have been hoping and expecting that the program will bring back Nicodemus. I will now reveal the conclusion of the story. Right from the beginning of the 4th episode, when Mary began looking for assistance, I had the impression that it was Nicodemus because of her relationship to him in the 1st season. It makes me happy that the show is going to return to their connection, and I'm looking forward to seeing him play a role in the show. In addition, the fake out that was set up for the occasion was entertaining. Nevertheless, I believe that they could have misled us a little bit more. I think it would have been wonderful if they had given more weight to the possibility that Shmuel would kidnap Mary in order to obtain information. Having a moment of uncertainty is enjoyable, despite the fact that we are all aware of what is going to take place. The 5th episode, in my opinion, was lacking in a few areas. The 5th episode of Treading Water does not appear to have much going on, with the exception of the very significant conclusion. The disciples are having a hard time understanding Jesus and are worried about each other, which is something that they have been doing for the past couple of episodes. In addition, the religious authorities discuss the appropriate actions to take in response to Jesus, which is something they have been doing for the past few episodes as well. In order to better understand this, it is helpful to watch the episodes in consecutive order. Politics that are complicated. I continue to find the maneuvering that takes on between Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, and now Ananus to be somewhat complicated with regard to politics. On the other hand, this does not mean that I believe the 5th season of The Chosen is historically inaccurate in this aspect. There's a possibility that it would be worthwhile to gradually develop these characters if the show were to commence in Season 1 with the same budget that it has at the moment. I believe that a little bit more streamlining would have been good given the very short amount of time that the program has to introduce us to a large number of these characters, as well as their reasons for doing things, their relationships, and their points of view. This problem is made worse by the fact that many names are similar to one another. For example, Ananus and Annas, Shimon, Shmuel, and Shammai, which might cause characters to become confused with one another. I also believe that a lot of the characters start to sound quite similar to one another. For example, Caiaphas has scorn for the Pharisees' comprehension, Ananus has contempt for Caiaphas' lack of understanding, and so on. It's possible that this is a part of the point. Despite this, the amount of time we spend on a group of villains that are very similar to one another and whom we know very little about takes away from the characters, in whom we have a greater emotional investment. Theater experience. I believe that 3 episodes is a bit too much for a single theater experience. I mentioned this back in Season 4, and I will say it again. I believe that 3 episodes is a little too much. A total of 2 episodes seems to be the optimal amount. Obviously, I am aware that the majority of people would not be willing to pay for 4 different showings, and there's also the possibility that another separate showing might postpone the public distribution by 1 week. At this point, I find myself longing for the model of Season 3, in which only the 2 opening episodes and the 2 concluding episodes were shown in theaters. In general, the episodes that come at the beginning and end of each season are the most significant events, and they're the ones that truly merit a theatrical experience. However, I am uncertain as to whether or not the theatrical showing genie will be returned to its bottle for the entire season. Concepts that are crucial to the 5th season of The Chosen. Once more, I will be updating this post at a later time with my comments on the primary themes that were discussed in the episode. A couple that I will most likely emphasize are inappropriate zeal, arrogance, and a lack of humility. The warning that Jesus gives to his disciples that one of them would betray him serves as a test that shows the personality and principles that lie under the surface of those who follow him. Those individuals, such as Thomas, who sincerely question themselves and their ability for sin, are demonstrated to have the appropriate level of humility, and their fidelity is recognized and validated. On the opposite end of the spectrum is Judas, who falsely maintains his own innocence by making slanderous insinuations about Thomas. Judas is at the opposite end of the spectrum. However, Judas is not the only person who exhibits a lack of strong moral integrity. Andrew is so preoccupied with preserving the high standing that his family has inside the movement that he does not appear to engage in any kind of self-examination that is characterized by humility. When it comes to the betrayer, the conversation quickly devolves into a struggle over status. Therefore, it is necessary for Jesus to remind the disciples that the position that an individual possesses in his kingdom is not the same as it is in the world. In Luke 22, verses 24 to 27, it is written that people who boastfully proclaim their superiority are brought down, while those who graciously serve others are ultimately elevated to a higher position. In point of fact, the apostles will be elevated to positions of prominence and responsibility inside the kingdom. Nevertheless, this will only occur upon the condition that they have joined Jesus in humbly enduring trials and tribulations simultaneously. In the 5th episode, we are presented with a multitude of examples of arrogant behavior. It is clear that Caiaphas and Ananias have the utmost disdain for one another as well as for the Pharisees. At the same time that each of them believes that he possesses unique insight, they are unwilling to listen to and engage with the thoughts that others have to offer. In the meantime, Shmuel exhibits an arrogant attitude in the Sanhedrin with regard to theology and the interpretation of the Bible. He is not even willing to consider the valid issues that Yosef and Shimon have brought up. In the same vein, Pilate chooses not to pay attention to the issues that Claudia has brought up and dismisses her with a superior attitude, presuming that she has never been put in a position where she must make difficult choices before. The casual manner in which he disregards the circumstances surrounding Jesus is another facet of his arrogance that displays itself. A significant number of the disciples, in response to the predictions that Jesus made, likewise exhibit their hubris. The three individuals, Andrew, Peter, and Simon Z, are all attempting to devise rationales in order to explain away the straightforward meaning of what Jesus stated. Despite the fact that Judas is willing to accept the overall framework of what Jesus stated, he reads his own beliefs into it without question. Instead of humbly standing by Jesus in the midst of the hardship, seeking greater clarity from Jesus, or engaging in discourse with the other disciples, he arrogantly thinks that he is aware of what is occurring and how to bring about the outcome that he desires. Matthew and John are among the few disciples who are so humble that they allow themselves to simply take the words of Jesus at face value, despite the fact that his predictions contradict the assumptions and expectations that they have built up in their minds. When it comes to episode 5, the majority of the characters who behave in an arrogant manner are not acting in bad faith. It would appear that Caiaphas is sincerely convinced that he is carrying out the plan that God has for him. There is little doubt that Judas and Shmuel, who is under the impression that he is exemplifying Psalm 69 verse 9, are in the same boat. It is not a lack of enthusiasm for God that is the issue with these personalities. Rather, it is a narrow-minded certainty and an inability to re-examine their own assumptions, interpretations, and beliefs. At the conclusion of the episode, Nicodemus makes a comeback, which is extremely appropriate for a show that is centered on the struggle between intellectual and theological arrogance and humility. In The Chosen Season 1, Shmuel functioned as an exemplar of religious elitism and narrow-mindedness, while Nicodemus was often characterized by religious humility and openness, particularly as the season continued. Nicodemus' decision to not follow Jesus was ultimately the result of his reluctance to let go of his status and comfort in order to follow Jesus. This was the case despite the fact that Nicodemus was receptive to the idea of following Jesus. Comparison between trust and doubt. In addition, the frigid opening of the Last Supper establishes a tension between faith and mistrust that is present throughout the entire program. When Jesus warns his followers about the traitor, they instantly begin to question not only their own leadership, but also the leadership of their fellow disciples. However, one of the reasons that Jesus foretells his betrayal is so that the disciples will eventually realize that he was in charge of the situation the entire time and thus be able to place a greater level of trust in him. He has to challenge them to wait for further clarification, despite the fact that they want to understand more at this moment. Trust is the central theme of the fig tree incident, as one might expect. In the passage from Mark 11 verses 22 to 24, Jesus is reminding the disciples of what they are capable of accomplishing, i.e. moving mountains, if they have faith that God would answer their prayers. In addition, Jesus is cautioning the disciples about the consequences that will befall them if they do not believe God and instead give in to doubt. There's a curse that the fruitless fig tree will eventually die and become nothing. In the same way, the religious establishment in Jerusalem will be cursed on account of their lack of faith and will ultimately shrivel away. Cf. John 15 verses 4 to 6. In a disappointing turn of events, the majority of the disciples did not put their faith in Jesus. A few of individuals have doubts about the obvious meaning of his statements and attempt to rationalize them by stating that he's having a bad day. Some individuals are willing to acknowledge that what he is predicting will take place, but they are beginning to question their decision to follow him over the previous 3 years. Contrary to popular belief, Caiaphas is a more trustworthy individual than many of the disciples. Caiaphas is persuaded that this is God's plan, and he is willing to entrust the success of the plan to God through prayer. This is despite the fact that some of the Pharisees have doubts about their ability to locate and arrest Jesus in the allotted time. The trust that Caiaphas placed in him is rewarded, which is an even bigger irony. In spite of the fact that what he requests appears to be unattainable, he is granted the precise direction that he requested for through the assistance of Shmuel and Judas. What were your thoughts on the 5th episode of the 5th season of The Chosen? Thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts, questions, and hypotheses in the comment section below. What exactly is meant by the term The Chosen? Without going into too much detail, I found that thinking about what adaptations are and how they function was beneficial in getting my young people to think about them. Give an explanation. The 4 Gospels are being adapted into a streaming series called The Chosen, which will have multiple seasons. There are a lot of characters and storylines that are based on events that take place in the Gospels, but there are also a lot of characters and events that the creators made up in order to make more sense of everything. There are also personalities and stories from the Gospels that have been omitted by the authors of the game. You could wish to ask the following questions in order to get a better understanding of the reasons why the producers might want to introduce new characters and stories while leaving out some ones. What are some more well-known examples of novels that have been adapted into films or television shows, such as Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter? While you're thinking about adaptation, are there any characters or storylines that you can think of that were contributed by cinema? Your thoughts on why the makers decided to include them? The larger role that Arwen plays in Lord of the Rings, along with certain action scenes, are sure to appeal to a variety of audiences and look great on screen. Are you able to think of any individuals or storylines that were not included in the movie? It is your opinion as to why they were taken away. For Lord of the Rings, Tom Bombadil, enough words. Having a conversation about these questions wouldn't take me too much time. A brief moment to emphasize the following point. As a result of the fact that what works in a book is not always the same as what works in television or film, adaptations frequently include the addition of new details, the modification of existing ones, and the omission of others. No attempt is being made by The Chosen to tamper with the Bible. Changes are made by the creators in order to adapt the biblical stories to the modern world. The Chosen presents a large number of characters, and it wants us to just keep up with them all. I discovered that my younger self had a difficult time distinguishing between the many characters, so you might want to consider creating a little slide presentation of the most important characters by making use of the character images that I have included throughout this page. In addition, I recommend that you establish your expectations for the first episode. It's possible that some young people will see the presentation as a little slow until Jesus arrives. When a new character appeared, we made it into a game, and one of my younger friends would question, "Is that Jesus?" over and over again. This was done throughout the entire process. Watching the first episode of The Chosen. Because of the constraints imposed by COVID, my youth group viewed The Chosen online through the use of Zoom. On YouTube, you may watch the first episode for free, despite the fact that there are a lot of advertisements. In the event that you're concerned about the possibility of simultaneously streaming and participating in Zoom, you can also acquire the DVDs of the first season on Amazon. While I was watching the program, I occasionally offer comments through the chat, but I made an effort to avoid doing too much teaching. I wanted the young people to think that The Chosen was more than just an elaborate representation of preaching, and I wanted them to enjoy it. The majority of the time, I just stated who the characters were. For more information, see my comment above. And on occasion, I provided a brief explanation of a reference or allusion that was puzzling to me when I was younger. In addition, we just had a good time discussing about unrelated topics, such as how Quintus was a perfect example of the archetype of the bald, evil man. For the purpose of discussing the first episode of The Chosen, I found that there are a few verses from the Bible that were appropriate. This is the first paragraph that discusses Mary Magdalene, sometimes known as Lilith. Almost immediately after that, Jesus continued his journey through all of the cities and villages, proclaiming and preaching the good news of the kingdom of God. In addition to the 12, Jesus was accompanied by a number of women who had been cured of bad spirits and illnesses. These included Mary, also known as Magdalene, from whom 7 devils had been expelled, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, as well as a great number of other women who had supplied for them out of their own resources. Excelsior, Luke 8 verses 1 to 3. It will be like follows. The character who has been referred to as Lilith during the majority of the first episode of The Chosen is revealed to be Mary Magdalene at the conclusion of the show. In case you missed it, this information is presented to you. One of the rare times that Mary Magdalene is mentioned in the Gospels, this text is one of those times. The events that took place in the first episode show how Jesus cast out these devils from her. Mary is never referred to as Lilith in any of the Gospels. There's a strong possibility that the creators of The Chosen choose this name due to the fact that in Jewish traditions, it is associated with angels. According to The Chosen, the fact that Mary is located in the Red Quarter gives the impression that she is a prostitute of some kind. No indication is ever found in the Bible that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. However, because to the fact that the story that comes before Luke 8 is about a prostitute being pardoned, some biblical interpreters made the error of labeling her according to this description. This label has persisted with her throughout the years, and numerous adaptations now portray her in this manner. Having shared such information, you are able to inquire about. When you saw The Chosen, what aspects of Mary Magdalene's portrayal stood out to you the most? To what extent do you believe that Mary's life was different before the arrival of Jesus? What caused you to believe that Mary was portrayed in The Chosen as a prostitute? Have you witnessed any other instances in which Jesus makes a sudden appearance and brings about a significant transformation in the life of another person? But now, the Lord, who is the one who created you, O Jacob, and who shaped you, O Israel, says, "Do not be afraid, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name, and you are mine. When you travel through the seas, I will be with you. When you travel through the rivers, they will not be able to overpower you. When you travel through the flames, you will not be burned, and the flame will not devour you. Due to the fact that I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, and your Redeemer." Isaiah 43 verses 1 to 3 English Standard Version. It will be like follows. This particular scripture, which was taught to Mary by her father, is taken from the book of Isaiah. A significant number of Christians continue to commit this scripture to memory in order to be reminded of the fact that God is always with us, even in the most trying of times. It provides a great deal of solace in the middle of the pandemic and other forms of upheaval. After then, you are free to inquire. Who is it in the chapter that makes the statement, "I have called you by name"? He who is Lord. In the show, who is it that is responsible for saying these words? The Lord Jesus. The question is, what does this imply about the identity of Jesus? He is the God. Are there times when you might require a reminder that God is with you? If so, can you think of those times? The final section is a bonus that can be chosen by younger readers who enjoy going into greater depth. There is an indication as to where the show is likely to go. Mary Magdalene arrived at the tomb early on the first day of the week, when it was still dark, and discovered that the stone had been removed from the tomb. She realized that the stone had been removed. Therefore, she fled and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, who was the one whom Jesus loved, and she told them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Peter then went out with the other disciple, and they were heading in the direction of the tomb. On the other hand, Mary was seen standing outside the tomb and crying. As she did so, she bent down to gaze inside the grave. As she looked, she saw two angels dressed in white sitting in the spot where the corpse of Jesus had been laid, one at the head and the other at the feet. She was confronted with the question, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him," she replied to them. "I do not know where to find him." After making the statement, she turned around and saw Jesus standing right in front of her, but she was unaware that it was exactly Jesus. In response to her, Jesus asked, "Woman, why are you crying now? Who are you expecting to find?" Under the assumption that he was the gardener, she addressed him with the following words, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away myself." She was addressed by Jesus as Mary. She whirled around and addressed him in Aramaic, saying, "Rabboni," which is English for teacher. Jesus told her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Jesus was referring to the fact that he had not yet ascended to the Father. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples and declared, "I have seen the Lord," and she also mentioned that he had told her these things. John 20 verses 1 to 3, 11 to 18, English Standard Version. It will be like follows. The events surrounding this text take place at the conclusion of the Gospels, after the death and resurrection of Jesus. After then, you are free to inquire. At first, Mary does not immediately recognize Jesus. "Is there anyone who has noticed what it was that caused her to recognize me?" He refers to her by her chosen name. How does this relate to the events that took place in the first episode? In the final moments, when he is healing her, he addresses her by name. Do you think that the Chosen is attempting to make a connection between the first episode and the events that will take place when Jesus is resurrected? Do you have faith that Jesus is familiar with your name? Which of these truths do you find encouraging? Introduction to the second episode of the first season of The Chosen. What is Shabbat? In spite of the fact that each episode of The Chosen follows a number of characters, Mary Magdalene, Nicodemus, Matthew, Simon, Andrew, and of course Jesus all feature prominently. And there are several other smaller biblical characters like Thaddeus and James. I believe that it is most effective to center the discussion of the show around just one or two primary themes. The primary focus of this episode is, as one might expect, the Sabbath or Shabbat. When it comes to the ancient Jewish observance of Shabbat, many young people are unfamiliar with it. The primary context in which they have encountered it has most likely left them with a negative impression. It is most prominently featured in the Gospels as a legalistic sledgehammer that the Pharisees wield in an effort to destroy the Jesus movement. Because of this, it is possible that your students will perceive Shabbat as being synonymous with legalism or works righteousness. This is the reason why I would recommend that you start your time with a conversation about the original purpose that God had for the Sabbath. Below are some questions that you might want to ask. In addition to the word Sabbath or Shabbat, what additional words or phrases come to mind when you hear the sound of these words? When you think of the Sabbath, do you primarily associate it with happy or bad feelings? In the event that your young people bring up the concept of legalism, do you believe that God had a purpose for the Sabbath that was not legalistic? Following that, you can demonstrate this informative video that was produced by the Bible Project. Following your viewing of the video, you might wonder, why did God choose to establish the seventh day of the week, as well as other periods for celebrations? What is the significance of the Sabbath in relation to Jesus? When your younger audience inquires as to why you are using so much time to discussing the Sabbath, you should explain that it is an essential part of the storyline of Episode 2. Viewing the second episode of The Chosen. Because of the restrictions imposed by COVID, my youth group viewed The Chosen online through the use of Zoom. The second episode is available on YouTube at this link. You may find the Blu-ray version of the movie on Amazon if you want to escape the advertisements. There are a lot of them, or the requirement to stream it. During the time that I was watching The Chosen, I occasionally participated in the chat and offered comments, but I made an effort to avoid teaching too much. Rather than viewing The Chosen as merely an elaborate instance of preaching, I wanted the younger generation to take pleasure in it. The majority of the time, I just defined who the characters were, particularly for those who missed the first episode. And every once in a while, I provided a brief explanation of a reference or allusion that could have been unclear to me when I was younger. Answers to discussion questions regarding The Chosen Season 1 Episode 2. To kick off your conversation about the second episode of The Chosen, I would like to invite you to talk about a couple of questions. In the episode, how many meals were depicted during the Shabbat? Those belonging to Mary, the Pharisees, Eden, and of Matthew. In your opinion, which meal would you be more interested in attending? What was the significance of Mary's Shabbat for her? The event served as a proof that Mary had been set free from the demon and that Jesus had given her a new life. According to Nicodemus and the Pharisees, what was the significance of the Shabbat for them? It was an opportunity for them to demonstrate whether or not they were trustworthy and important. What are some of the other distinctions that could be made between the Shabbat of Mary and the Shabbat of Nicodemus and the Pharisees, according to your observations? X. Who was invited to the event? What was the primary focus of their attention? I. What are your thoughts on the reason that Jesus decided to go to the Shabbat of Mary? It is important to explain that The Chosen makes use of the distinctions between Mary's Shabbat and the Shabbat of Nicodemus the Pharisees in order to demonstrate the contrast between two very different perspectives on what the Sabbath and Shabbat are all about. Jesus draws attention to the distinctions between these two visions in Luke 14 verses 1 to 24, English Standard Version. During the course of one Sabbath, when he went to eat at the home of a Pharisee leader, they were keeping a close eye on him. Unbelievably, there was a man in front of him who was suffering from dropsy. And in response to the lawyers and Pharisees, Jesus asked, "Is it permissible to heal on the Sabbath, or is it not?" On the other hand, they did not speak. After that, he transported him, treated him, and then dispatched him. And he asked them, "Which of you, if you have a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out of the well?" And they were unable to provide a response to these things. Now, he told a parable to those who were invited, when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, "When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, 'Give your place to this person,' and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. However, if you're invited, you should go and sit in the lowest place possible. This will allow your host to say to you, 'Friend, move up higher.' When this happens, you will be honored in the company of everyone who sits at the table with you." The reason for this is that people who elevate themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid, he remarked to the guy who had invited him. This is because they may invite you in return and you will be repaid from them. You will be rewarded. However, if you invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind to a feast that you are hosting, this is because they are unable to repay you for your generosity. As a result, you will receive your due at the resurrection of the righteous. The moment that one of the individuals who were seated at the meal with him heard these things, he addressed him with the following words, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." On the other hand, he told him, "There was once a man who hosted a magnificent banquet and invited a large number of guests. In addition, when it was time for the meal, he dispatched his servant to make the announcement to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' However, they all started making excuses for their absence. It was the first person who informed him, 'I have purchased a field, and I need to go out and inspect it.' In addition, another individual stated, 'I have purchased 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to examine them. Please forgive me from this situation.' Another person remarked, 'I have married a wife, and as a result, I am unable to come.' The servant then went to his master and informed him of these things. 'Please excuse me,' the servant added. This caused the master of the house to become enraged, And he instructed his servant to go out quickly to the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in the poor and crippled and blind and lame. The servant responded by saying, "Sir, what you commanded has been done, and there is still room." The master then instructed the servant to go out to the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, so that my house may be filled. I tell you this because none of those men who were invited will ever get the chance to sample my dinner. When you have finished reading this passage from the Bible, you may ask, with regard to the manner in which the Pharisees observe the Sabbath, Shabbat, what is it that Jesus finds objectionable? According to Jesus, what is the purpose of the feasts that are held on the Sabbath? Why is it that people who are considered to be social misfits attend Sabbath feasts that are modeled after Jesus? What prevents those who are wealthy and prosperous from observing the Sabbath in the manner of Jesus? If you were to observe the Sabbath, Shabbat, in the same manner as Jesus and his disciples did, what would it look like for you to do so? Who would be invited to the event? Why may it be challenging to do so? Sabbath in the manner in which we see Mary Magdalene practice it in this episode of The Chosen is not only highly captivating and beautiful, but it is also very countercultural. For young people who are unfamiliar with this kind of activity, it is hoped that it will provide them with a perspective that broadens their understanding of what is feasible and desirable. This episode of The Chosen should, at the very least, make it clear that the Sabbath is not necessarily a job of self-righteous legalism, but rather that it can be a spiritual exercise that is beneficial to one's life. Questions for the introduction to the third Chosen episode, Imagining Jesus. So that we can get things rolling, you should invite your young people to talk about a few basic questions. In your opinion, what did Jesus appear to be like? Hair length and color, facial hair, and so on. What kind of personality do you think he have, in your opinion? If your children are familiar with the Myers-Briggs or Enneagram personality types, for example, you could ask them to try to identify what they believe he was. What factors have contributed to the formation of your mental image of Jesus when you think about him? If they say the Bible, then you should ask them to be more particular about the tales or portions they are referring to. If they say art or movies, then you should ask them if they recall which versions of those things explicitly. To what extent do you believe that the way you visualize Jesus in your mind has an impact on the way you pray or connect with God? It is important to take your time when answering these questions because they contain a great deal of potential for creating meaningful conversations. In order to learn more about what your pupils are thinking and to challenge their preconceived notions, you should ask them follow-up questions. It's possible that some students will try to avoid answering the question concerning Jesus' personality by claiming that Jesus embodied every single personality type. Call attention to the fact that this is not how personalities function. Both severe introversion and extreme extroversion are not possible for a single individual at the same time. A person could be somewhere in the middle of the two extremes, with a few characteristics of both, but that in and of itself is a distinct personality type that experiences life in a totally different way than someone who is at the opposite end of the spectrum. In order to illustrate your point, you could want to draw attention to the appearance of Jesus. Was he tall, average, or small in height? He had hair of what color, right? What gender did he identify as? In the case of concrete questions such as these, pupils will be compelled to select a single response. After that, you might want to bring up the following. Despite the fact that Jesus is a representative of all people in front of God, he was a unique individual in his own right. As is the case with each and every one of us, he possessed, and continues to possess, a personality to match his one-of-a-kind physical look. Despite the fact that we are all capable of and will one day be able to resemble Jesus in terms of holiness and love, we are not able to, and will not, all be able to resemble him in terms of our physical characteristics and personality. A person of Middle Eastern heritage is likely to have a skin tone or hair texture that is more similar to that of Jesus than a person of Swedish descent. Similar to how some people may have characteristics of their personalities that are more similar to those of Jesus than others. However, this does not imply that any one set of physical characteristics or mental traits is superior to any other. The Bible provides us with a very limited account of what Jesus looked like, and there are no images mentioned anywhere in the Bible. Consequently, throughout the course of history, artists and storytellers have endeavored to envision and describe what the appearance of Jesus was like. Try looking at these pictures of Jesus that were made by artists and filmmakers from different eras and civilizations. These pictures can be seen here. If you are able to point to pictures that represent the way that you portrayed Jesus when you were younger, I will provide you with a few examples that you might find useful below. Among the many types of images that show Christ, the Christ Pantocrator is a popular form that is particularly prevalent in Orthodox churches. Placed in the story that we have just read, would it be possible for someone to recapitulate the events that took place in the accounts that we read previously from Mark and Luke? What are some of the discrepancies between these two accounts of how Jesus first met Andrew and Simon? And how do these differences appear on the surface? Students will likely feel uncomfortable attending to apparent discrepancies in the Bible. They may be tempted to harmonize prematurely as they summarize each story or discuss the differences. Affirm their desire to pursue unity in Scripture and promise them that together you will eventually discuss how these stories could fit with one another. Explain, however, that for the sake of this exercise, you want to understand each story on its own terms before trying to make them fit together. After you have spent some time talking about the distinctions, you should bring up the following. When we hear two persons recount two accounts about the same occurrence that are notably different from one another, we frequently conclude that one of them is either lying or making a mistake, while the other is speaking the truth from the beginning. Sometimes these stories are even placed right next to each other, such as the two stories that 1 Samuel gives us about how David and Saul first met. However, in the Bible, we frequently see multiple stories about the same event that all differ from one another. Sometimes these differences are minor, and sometimes they are significant. It is natural for us to try to create a headcanon that explains how these stories fit together. This is a practice that readers of the Bible began doing within just a few decades of when the Gospels were finished. It is called harmonization, and it is a practice that was prevalent during the time period of the Bible. It is also natural for people to be more comfortable reading multiple different stories and accepting that there was truth in each of them. Before we attempt to harmonize the accounts found in the Gospels, it is helpful to consider the specific aspects that each Gospel focuses on and the reasons behind those specifics. Now, while you are discussing each of the stories, present them on the screen and ask, what are some important details in the story of how Jesus met Simon and Andrew told in the Gospel of Mark? What do you think this Gospel is interested in showing us? Mark is full of immediately moments. He really stresses the sudden disruption that Jesus brings. Its story emphasizes how sudden Jesus' entrance into the lives of Simon and Andrew felt and how they followed immediately. What are some crucial facts in the account of how Jesus met Simon and Andrew recorded in the Gospel of Luke? What do you think this Gospel is interested in presenting us? Luke is very concerned in how Jesus came for sinners and outcasts. Its story emphasizes how Simon considered himself as a sinful man. John is interested in the significance of witnessing God's work in Jesus and telling others. And the story of how Jesus met Simon and Andrew is told in the Gospel of John. What do you think this Gospel is trying to show us? John is interested in the importance of witnessing God's work in Jesus and telling others. Its story focuses on how Andrew was a witness. Explain this now. As we watch, think about how it ties these stories together and how it seeks to harmonize the accounts that can be found in Mark, Luke, and John. It demonstrates how these stories might all be accurate and true representations of how Jesus first met Andrew and Simon. Viewing the 4th episode of The Chosen. In order to circumvent the restrictions imposed by COVID, my youth group watched The Chosen online through the use of Zoom. Episode May 4th be seen on YouTube. The majority of the time, I just clarified who the characters were, especially considering that Episode 3 creates a gap in the storyline that began in Episode 1 and Episode 2, and occasionally I briefly explained a reference or allusion that was confusing to my youth. I did this because I wanted the youth to enjoy The Chosen and not just see it as an elaborate preaching illustration. I made occasional comments through the chat while I was watching The Chosen, but I tried not to do too much teaching. discussing the fourth episode of The Chosen. To kick off your conversation about the fourth episode of The Chosen, ask, having said that, what were your thoughts on the episode? In what ways do you believe they were successful in bringing together all three of the stories that we discussed earlier? Do you have any regrets or things that you would have done differently? In conclusion, I would like to bring up the following. There are times when people talk about the Bible being contradictory towards itself. However, it is typically not that difficult to think of creative ways to reconcile these so-called contradictions. Furthermore, if we consider what each gospel is doing, we can begin to understand why the authors may have told their stories in ways that are quite different from one another. One of the ways that Bible adaptations, such as The Chosen, can be of use to us is by providing a compelling illustration of how stories that appear to be in conflict with one another can nevertheless be brought together. Of course, The Chosen isn't the Bible. We don't know for sure if this is exactly how these stories fit together, but it does show us that there are perfectly reasonable explanations for why the Bible presents us with multiple stories of an event like the first meeting between Jesus, Andrew, and Simon.